This is Advisor 3.0, a show designed to help you as a financial advisor elevate your professional practice, transform your clients' lives, and take your business to the next level. I am Abraham Okusanya. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the podcast. A big part of the job of a financial planner is managing clients' behavior and educating them about why they need to focus more on the things they can control and far less on the markets and the things outside of their control. Mike LeGassick has studied behavioral economics for over 15 years and applies all of this knowledge in his work with clients. Mike is a financial planner, author, and behavioral coach at Manning and Company, a long-established financial advice business in Devon. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you today, Abraham. Thanks for arranging this.
It's a pleasure, Mike. Mike, give our audience a little bit of a background on the journey that brought you into this wonderful profession of ours.
Okay, well, I left school just before my 16th birthday, actually. I didn't go to university, and I largely went into retail, where a friend of mine offered me a job. So for the first part of my career, I worked for a furniture store and I worked in an electrical retailer. And then over a snooker match one night, because I played competitive snooker since I was 13, I saw a friend of mine that worked for Pearl Assurance who was a sales manager. And he said, look, you get on well with people, you're like a bit of a laugh, you easily get talked to. Do you fancy a career change? And I thought to myself, I am pretty much fed up working bank holidays, Saturdays, Sundays, and all the rest of it. So I thought I'd give it a go. So I took the Pearl Assurance aptitude test many years ago, managed to get through it. And to cut a long story short, I worked for Pearl Assurance as an insurance agent with the old industrial branch book on collecting small premiums from people that save regularly. The sad thing about it is that that's no longer available, and it did engender a savings mentality into young people, but that's by the by. And then through that journey, I went through to working for Lloyd's TSB as an advisor, Wesleyan Financial Services, and I was also part of Positive Solutions. So I've been an independent advisor for about 18 years, and I've been with Manning and Company for the last 11, and latterly the last 5 or 6 years as one of the directors.
Fascinating journey. Snookers, were you any good at it?
I did they say snookers a sign of a misspent youth, but I did play at sort of pro-amateur level. My highest break's 145. So I did play competitively Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and I used to practice a lot Saturdays when I was younger. So, and I played in pro-am tournaments. So, not good enough to be a pro, unfortunately. You need to be another level ahead. But certainly pretty good when I played regularly on an amateur level. Pretty good then, I would say. Yeah, I would say, pretty good standard when I was playing well when I was younger.
That's good. You could have been a professional snooker player, but you did the next best thing, which is become a financial planner.
I'm a little bit more successful as a planner, perhaps, as I would have been as a pro snooker player, put it that way.
Fair enough. Talk to us a little bit about Manning and Company as a business. Give us a background to the business and how you came to join the business.
Yeah, well, Manning and Company's been established for about 34 years. I think I think it's fair to say we're one of the longest established independent practices directly authorised down in the southwest of England. It was started by a guy called Manning, who was no longer part of it, long retired. And the reins were taken up by my fellow director, Paul Northmore, who's highly respected in the profession. And about 11 years ago, he approached me asking whether I would like to be part of the practice. You get a feel for people, and I just knew immediately that I could trust him implicitly. He talked a lot of sense, very humble, and we got on really, really well. And then I joined the practice like I said, 11 years ago, and then I became a director about 6 years ago, one of the directors. And that's it, basically. It's a great place to work. We're a medium-sized practice. We've got about 11 advisors, 6 admin team, and I've got my own dedicated personal assistant, Sharon, who's fantastic. Don't tell her that, of course, but she is fantastic. Clients love her. She's a great point of contact, very proactive, and she's a very integral part of my business. So, yeah, we've gone through the changes that everyone's had to go through and deal with the good, the bad, and the ugly, but we're still there at the coalface, and we very much enjoy what we do.
Fascinating stuff. So you have this interesting approach of talking to clients about what's really important when it comes to, financial planning, risk profiling. You have this interesting view on risk profiling. Shall we start with that? What are we all getting wrong when it comes to risk profiling clients?
I wouldn't say we're all getting it wrong. I think it's just a different way of coming from it. And I'll try and explain it in a way that makes sense. My first view is that risk profilers, you can have the best risk profiler devised by anyone, but it still won't do the job unless the client understands risk first. So imagine if you gave someone an attitude to risk questionnaire, a typical attitude to risk questionnaire, who had never invested money before, uneducated in the way financial markets work, and you just gave them that question to answer. The chances are they're going to answer it from a view of conservatism, that they're going to be conservative when they answer it, because their perception will believe that if they're dipping their toe into the stock market, they could lose all their money. That's their default position. Oh, the stock market. Now, stock market's all about framing. So imagine you were at a dinner party or a pub and you could speak to someone that you knew well enough to discuss finances, because it can be a taboo subject. Imagine if someone said to you, "Oh, Abraham, you've been around a bit. You know a lot about these types of things. I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you invest your money?" Now, you could answer that one of two ways. The first way you could answer it would be something on the lines of, "I invest over the long term in thousands of the greatest businesses in the world, the most well-funded and innovative companies, the type of companies that you, me, and everyone we know use every day of our lives without thinking about it, and I do it cost effectively." Now, someone might listen to that and think, that sounds perfectly reasonable and perhaps even enticing. It makes real common sense. You could, of course, answer it another way, and you could answer it by saying, "I invest in the stock market." And that will get an instant, "Well, that's risky, isn't it?" Or maybe it's because you're young and you've got time on your side. It's exactly, you and I know it's exactly the same thing, but the framing of it is vitally important. You have to convey that, and I have a way of explaining that to a client so they are under no illusion. But before I go into that, I personally think that every single attitude to risk questionnaire should have a preamble, a video, or a dialogue or some text that someone can read so they understand what the stock market is before they answer it. So my argument is, if you give someone a questionnaire without any education and they've got a retirement pot, answer it one way. 9 times out of 10, it will come out and err on the side of caution. If you then have a good conversation so the clients explain that and you understand it, I always tell clients they come in to see me with a suitcase full of M&Ms, not the chocolate variety. There are myths, misconceptions, and misunderstandings, and I have to debunk them. So when I have that conversation and they understand, and all the myths are unpacked and they understand what the market actually is, if I then said, "Now do that questionnaire again," you would get a very different result. No doubt. And I think the profession misses this by giving someone an ATR cold without education. They're understandably going to answer it from a conservative point of view for fear they can lose all their money. And I say the only 2 ways a client can lose money from a globally diversified, competitively priced contract is either someone like Putin pressing the red button, in which it's game over, or a meteor coming out of the sky and having the thing Because just to finish that point, because if you take those two Armageddon situations off the table and you still believe we can function as a society, whether banks, insurance, retailers, tech, utility companies, you're basically saying the world will continue without those companies existing, and that's game over. All roads lead back to Armageddon. So I think it's imperative that a plain English explanation to a client is important before they do an attitude to risk questionnaire.
I like that phrase, plain English explanation to a client, and I'll come back to this in a second. But there are people, respected people in our profession, who actually make the case that we should stop doing them. I know some of the best financial planners, around, who say to me, Abraham, I don't do risk profiling questionnaire anymore, and we should consign these things to the bin. What do you say about that?
I tend to agree, because the FCA want to know that you've demonstrated the client understands what they're doing. And I don't think an attitude to risk questionnaire really does that. And I've seen some really good ones and I've seen some awful ones. But even the best I've seen, they still won't matter for the points I've raised unless the client comes from a position of understanding. So I don't think they should be called attitude to risk questionnaires anyway. My view is they should be called attitude to volatility questionnaires. Because I explain to clients that there are two risk ladders. And clients get this wrong nearly all the time. There are two risk ladders. Most clients are on one risk ladder, and they have nothing to do with the second one. And if you don't mind, I'll start with the second risk ladder first. Most people's perception of risk, if you say to someone in the street, if you stopped 100 people and said, imagine you've got a risk ladder with 10 rungs on the ladder, and if you keep going up the rungs of those ladders, what do you think that means as far as risk is concerned? I guarantee they will say, well, you're getting into riskier investments. You're getting into riskier investments. But you and I know for the majority of investors, that's not the case. Most people are invested globally in the stock market. Most people's perception is that as they go up the risk ladders, they are inherently going into riskier assets. Things like cryptocurrency, Brazilian teak farms, and Dubai car parks. So their perception is they're going up the risk ladder into inherently riskier assets, whereas if the global stock market, we're all in the same fund, effectively. It just depends how much exposure we've got to that, how much exposure we've got to the stock market. It's like having two glasses. One's full of water and one's half full. So the half full glass is only 50% of their money is in the stock market. The rest is in bonds and so on. Most people's perception is they're on a risk ladder with inherently riskier assets, but most people aren't. Most people are in the stock market. So all that risk ladder really means is how much of my money do I want placed in the areas that have historically produced the best returns over the long term. You are not on risk ladder one. Very few people are on this risk ladder. These are dangerously more volatile investments where you could lose significant or all of your wealth. But that's people's perception. Their perception is they're going into riskier assets. They're not. So to finish off this point, I've come up with a way that I think conveys what the stock market is, and I explain it in my book. And I call it a day in the life. So my view is, imagine you wake up in the morning. Well, I'll pre-qualify that. What I first say to clients is, go and get a recent statement from your current account. Have a look at it. Where does most of your money go? And most people will answer the same way: bills, mortgage, utilities, food, fuel. I said, okay, who do you think is getting the better end of the deal? You or the companies that you're buying those services off? It's a rhetorical question. And they'll say, well, of course, the companies, they're in business. That's why they do it. I said, okay, then. So you've just agreed then that you and I and everyone we know are lining the pockets of thousands of companies in the developed world every day of our lives. And you think owning pieces of those companies is a risky thing to do. Well, let's just put that into perspective, a day in the life. So I said, imagine you wake up in the morning. It's not your alarm clock that wakes you up. It's normally your phone. Samsung or iPhone sell millions of these every day. You might check your social media, Facebook. You'll turn your thermometer up and down. That's British Gas. And you've tapped into Honeywell, who make thermometers around the globe. If you go for a jog, you probably put Nikes on. They sell 25,000 pairs a second globally. And you might come back and use your Dove soap and your Head and Shoulders shampoo and your Gillette razor. You have your Kellogg's cornflakes or your Nescafe checking out Sky News. You haven't left the house yet and you've already used 10 or 12 companies. You fill your cart with fuel, you grab a drive-by coffee, you see a JCB digger, it goes on. You watch Netflix in the evening, you go to B&Q, everyday occurrences of people's lives. So most people interact with at least 20 companies a day. 90% of them buy, they have to use them, and 10%, the Netflixes and the Amazons of this world, is discretionary. Clients are beginning to understand now that they are funding these companies and making their profits grow. They're beginning to understand what the stock market is. Their perception of the stock market is a scary day trading situation out of like Trading Places movie. The reality is it's woven into what we do every day of our lives, and everyone that's ever lived has done it. So economies grow, but they do have their tough times. One of the phrases that I can't stand in advisors saying is your investments can go down as well as up. I hate that. I tell all my clients your investments are categorically going to fall in value from time to time. Not might, not could, they will. To think otherwise means they go up every single day for the rest of their lives, which is ridiculous. So managing expectations. I'm very careful with the words I use with clients. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an important problem. You know, the legendary Jack Bogle says, the stock market is a distraction from the business of investing.
Yes.
And the way you described, the global equity portfolio, for instance, which is, a basket of the best and the brightest companies, not just that we use in our everyday lives, but actually some of whom we can't do without. So, like, if you explain to someone and you say, well, look, I invest my money in, the best and the brightest companies around the world that we use in everyday life, some of whom you can't actually do without. You have to use them. Some people might disagree with that, but actually that it is true. Versus this thing, which we say, I invest in the stock market, and therefore all the emotions, all the misconceptions, all the fear that comes with that, it's sad that these wrong words or phrases then feeds through into all of our interaction with clients. And as you said, the challenge is how we begin to remove these words from our conversation with clients and replace them with different words that evokes different emotions.
Yeah, I think storytelling and everyday analogies, people can relate to those. They make sense. They debunk things quickly. My new book, The Mind Over Markets, is full of analogies and stories that convey what many people believe to be sticky, mundane, boring, or difficult things to understand, to explain them in a way that anyone can understand them. The whole book is built around that, on reflection and thinking that you think you know something. I mean, Warren Buffett, risk is not, not knowing what you're doing. It's clients are full of, they don't know what they don't know, but they have got a bucket full of M&Ms, as I say, because, things that they've told, things they've heard down the pub, things they've seen on TV. The education, it's probably coming through in spades. I'm a massive advocate of plain English, honest, transparent education. Clients will make fully informed choices. I have an easier life. There are no surprises. The phone never rings with someone saying, you never said this could happen. Yes, I did. I've covered it details and I keep reminding people to do it. I want to have an easy life. I want to sleep easy at night. And the best way I can do that is being transparently honest. And sometimes that's telling people the unvarnished truth, but then I'd prefer uncomfortable truths and comforting lies. I don't work in that arena. And I think clients appreciate that.
So talk to me about this process that you go through when a client first comes to you. They come with a basket of M&Ms, and what do? Do you start that process of education right there and there? And what does that entail?
Right. Well, I developed a qualifying question that immediately tells me whether they understand the stock market or not. And the qualifying question is, when we discuss the niceties and we're getting into it, the qualifying question I thought up was, and most people I deal with would remember Black Monday, 1987. So I should say to them, do you remember what Black Monday 1987 was? And most people say, well, yeah, there was a stock market crash or disaster. They've got some idea of what it was. Right. And then I'd say, well, yes, basically it was, and it remains to this day pretty much the biggest stock market crash in UK history. And then I say, do you know what the FTSE 100 is? Well, yeah. And then I explain in plain English what the FTSE 100 is. They understand that. They've now got a benchmark of knowing what it is. And then I say to them, imagine you had £100,000 invested in the FTSE 100. You come home from work, you put the news headlines on, and you see the headlines saying, biggest stock market crash in UK history. I asked the client, how much do you think your 100,000 was worth after that news? And then I shut up. And the answers I've gotten over the years are largely 0 to 50%. Wow. Now that immediately tells me they don't understand how the stock market works. They are thinking this is the scariest, riskiest thing they're ever going to do, and they can lose all their money. And then I educate them that the market fell, 22% in 48 hours, and it's way past the point before which it dropped now. And I say, in order for you to have lost all your money, every company that we'd have used in our everyday lives would have gone to the wall. Game over. World ends. Good night. And then they look back and they don't look foolishly, but they say, well, of course it would be. I never thought about it that way. So I'm trying to make it in a common sense way. Now, if they come back and say, well, it was worth about 80%, wasn't it? I think, right, they're on the right page. But a lot of people say, I've lost all my money, because they compute a stock market crash is losing everything.
Yeah, poof, and it's gone.
Yeah, this is their conception. These are the M&Ms that I keep referring to. I have to take a very basic point of view in a diplomatic fashion. Obviously, you don't want a client to feel foolish in front of you or scared to ask a question. But I think I've cultivated a way in coaxing them along to make them realize, well, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know why I thought about that. Or now that you've explained it that way, that resonates. That of course that couldn't happen. They're beginning to get on the journey of understanding what this big, scary animal, the stock market, is. That's when they're beginning to understand. When they begin to understand, they'll answer the attitude to risk questionnaire from an honest, informed position, and I can be satisfied and assured that we are on the same page as far as that's concerned.
Right. So just to be clear, you do this attitude to this risk questionnaire thing, and you do it, but you do it after you've had a conversation and an education around risk. Oh, no.
Absolutely right. Because right. To do anything otherwise is a false representation. Because it's like you taking an exam in any field. If you have misconceptions, you're bound to get questions wrong, or you're bound to answer them incorrectly because you don't understand the premise behind what you're answering. If they become to get educated, it's not about steering the client or leading the witness in a courtroom. It's nothing like that. It's I have confidence that when I have those conversations, and then I say, now fill in the questionnaire after we've debunked the myths, so you're now coming from a position of knowledge. Now take the questionnaire. Now that you think, this doesn't compute to that, and that doesn't mean this. I just don't. It's never sat comfortably with me on giving someone who's never invested before an attitude to risk questionnaire and really expecting them to answer it from a position of knowledge. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, no, I think you have a very, very good point. I went through an experience recently with my wife, and look, we can look at this and we can say, oh, these people are just not, financially aware or educated. My wife, is a social worker, has a master's degree in social work, obviously. So I'm saying this is like, an educated, reasonable individual, right? And we just, without context, right? I just sent her, the timeline risk questionnaire. And 2 days later, we had this conversation. I said, "You haven't completed the risk, the thing I sent you." And she was like, "Oh, I started it. I went halfway, and I just don't understand." This thing, some of these things that you're asking me, some of these words that you're saying, even words like volatility. I mean, it's anxiety inducing. Now, of course, after so I actually took a lot of feedback about these things, about some of this language, things that we just take for granted in financial services, and then we spent, I don't know, 10 minutes just having this conversation, going through the questions. And she did complete the questions, got the results out. And, for me, that is just like, a case study for what you're talking about, that we send these questions to clients even after you've explained it to them without a real good understanding of how the capital market works and all that stuff. The answer is meaningless. So I am not in the camp of people who say, oh, we should just not do anything. I am more in the camp of, either you do this thing as a beginning of conversation, as part of the conversation that you have with the client, an education conversation, that you have with the client, and then maybe send it to them again after you've had that conversation, and maybe you compare and contrast the results, or that it should only be done in the context of a meaningful conversation about how the capital market works. Where are you in that debate? Are you still very much education first and then, the questionnaire?
Yeah, my view is something like a preamble. You either send the client a very brief, easy to digest, plain English explanation of terms, volatility, with an example, or something they can tick to say, I've read it, or a video to explain it. You could do an explainer video, covering the points, trying to remember to see it from a client's fresh eyes point of view and not from our experience point of view. So dumb it down into plain English, read this or watch this, and then answer the questionnaire. I think you're certainly going to get a far more accurate response once they have a level bedding ground roots education or understanding of how these things work. Giving it to them cold just does not make any sense to me. I would never do that personally. I always want the conversation to gauge the client's understanding. They may be very experienced. I don't need to go down it anymore. But if they're not, and the majority of people, particularly first-time investors, are not, and it's understandable, why would they be, then an explainer video or a booklet, a very brief booklet, or some text that they tick to say they've read before answering it would go some way to getting better, more meaningful results.
Good stuff. So risk is one area that there's clearly misconception, and we've talked about that. In your work with clients, what areas what other areas of misconceptions do you see, especially relating to general behavioral issues?
Retirement's a big one, where people tend to believe they're only invested up to retirement. That's a common one I see.
Right.
And then I say, well, where do you think your income's going to come from? They just don't understand. And I know this is deep rooted in annuities and lifestyle funds, which again, I've got a real problem with. There are millions of workplace pension people that are blind, tap dancing into a financial minefield blindly because they're being de-risked sometimes as 15 years out into lower risk assets. And then they wonder why the pension was the point of it and what a waste of time that was, because they had no education, no reviews, and no level of knowledge. And this is all happening quietly in the background, and they're completely unassuming. It's a disgrace, in my opinion. This really needs to be addressed. So that's on the back of when people used to annuitize. Of course, you would want to protect the capital if you're about to hand it over. You don't want any market, shenanigans going on before you hand the money across. But most people these days go into drawdown. So their perception is already deep-rooted and embedded in their psyche that as they get nearer to retirement, they need to de-risk dramatically, which you and I know it is destitute by decision,
Yeah.
So they need to understand that, no, you're not invested for 20 years. You're invested for perhaps 30 or 40 years at least. And where's your income? So that's another debunking conversation to have with clients. And I use a similar format to explain that to clients. I want something that sits in between, but I want to get this across before, and I think it's a good example that it certainly works for me anyway. Sitting between the risk conversation we've just had and then going into retirement, I often take with me into a meeting a crystal ball and set it in front of the clients. I find it's a really good icebreaker because people look at the crystal ball and I say, oh, I hope you don't mind. This is the 65th one I've tried, but none of them have worked previously. And it's a bit of a joke. But I take it a step further. And what I say is, well, imagine, Mr. Client, Mrs. Client, imagine that we were having this meeting in 2013, 10 years ago, and this crystal ball does work. And we've got the great opportunity of seeing what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Let's have a look. And I look at the crystal ball and I go, wow, there's going to be a global health pandemic that's going to close down the global economy for 2 years. There's going to be rising inflation, an illegal invasion of Ukraine. We're going to have a Trump presidency, spiraling interest rates, God knows what any other disasters. Now, I would have said, you've probably already bolted for the door. But if I'd managed to have stopped you and held you and said, before you go, before you were thinking of, I'm not going to invest this money, there's just something else I need to show you. I can see that in 2013, that the S&P 500, which I would have explained what that means, was valued at 1,848 in 2013. Today, it's about 4,400. It's up 142%. With all this disaster in these forthcoming years, it's still up 142%. With all this nonsense, the clients then begin to get a perception of this too shall pass. Markets rise over time. So, and I incorporate the crystal ball example because it's a fact. 10 years ago, you probably would have run out the door knowing what was coming down the pipeline. But look what happened. So I'm always trying to find or think of creative ways that resonate with clients, and they're amusing. They do help break the monotony of talking about money and so on and so forth. So, and I think that sits between risk and retirement. People are beginning to join the dots. They're beginning to see that they had, at no fault of their own, a huge disconnect between what they think things are and how they work and how they actually work. And I get a real buzz off that part of my job. That gives me the most satisfaction in anything I do, debunking the myths and explaining ways that resonate, and light bulb moments come on with clients saying, I never had it explained that way before.
I like the crystal ball analogy because it's so like physical. We talk about these things like we say, oh, I don't have a crystal ball, or if I had a crystal ball, but actually having it on your desk in the client's meeting, it's so powerful. Let's talk about how you overcome the misconceptions around the retirement element. So we've talked about the risk. We've talked about, the fact that markets, do have their ups and downs, and we're going to stick to it. How do you have the conversation around the need to take a long-term view and to stay invested during retirement?
Yeah, so what I do basically, we have a conversation about the cost of living. And people everyone's got their own points in their lives where they can remember the cost of something. So I will hone in and focus on something they remember buying 20 years ago. How much a holiday cost, or a flight, or a loaf of bread, or a pair of shoes. People can generally have a reference point. And then I tell them how much things are today. And then we have the conversation about inflation, which I call the silent assassin. So did you ever see the original Terminator film?
No, I can't remember it. No.
The original Terminator is when the Terminator is after Sarah Connor. The guy that's trying to save her grabs her in the car and says, you must realize the Terminator, it can't be reasoned with, it can't be bargained with, it can't be bought, and it absolutely will not stop. And I then change that to inflation. I say Inflation can't be reasoned with, it can't be bargained with, it can't be bought, and it absolutely will not stop. It's relentless in eroding your wealth. So I convey the cost of living and what the long-term trend cost of living is in the US and the UK, and then I explain how much their income needs to be worth in the future. But I have a caveat with that. I do not subscribe to the fact that income must perpetually increase at a given rate until the day we die. My view, maybe it's a little bit radical, but I tend to say that most people slow down in their mid to late 70s. I say more on heating, less on eating, maybe, those type of examples. So I say, how many 80-year-olds do you know that are spending at the same rate they did at 60? Well, no one. But you're going to get the odd exception, admittedly, but by and large, they don't. So I don't want people to be worried to think that they've got to perpetually have their income increasing at a rate that they might need at 60 to 70 and continue to do that into their 80s and 90s. Long-term care off the table for the moment, but under normal circumstances, we spend much less. So I say, if getting on a plane to Vegas was your thing at 60, it probably won't be when you're 80. And in my experience, people nearly always resonate with that. So I say, you've got this golden opportunity of your golden years of late 60s, mid 70s with a bit of luck, the hips and knees and the backs haven't gone, where you should enjoy the fruits of your labor. Now it's payback time. And we need to plan accordingly that you can do the things that you promised yourself you would do once you've reached this point in your life. Yes, your day-to-day living costs will continue to increase. Food, fuel, utilities. Aside from that, your discretionary spending will probably slide more often than not. And in my experience, people nearly always tend to agree. Yeah, you slow down, you don't go out very often. So mine is to try and bridge the misperception of it, my income must continue to rise at this given rate, where in reality, it generally plateaus, and it certainly doesn't need to rise at the rate it might need to do when you're in your early retirement years. Again, with the caveat of long-term care can throw a serious spanner in the works, and we would plan for that accordingly. So it's trying to take the pressure off people of worrying, removing the worry. How is my income going to continue at this rate? So, well, Mrs. Klein, in actual fact, it probably won't need to. And then focusing in on state pensions. I mean, if you look at a portfolio, I'm just segueing here. If you look at, say the typical portfolio, 60, 40, 70, 30 equities and stocks, let's just use that as an example. You really ought to be factoring in 2 state pensions and to capitalize the value on that, because your state pension, in effect, is like having it in bonds, for want of a better word, lower risk, more secure to a degree. So if you've got a client who's got $500,000 to invest, my view is you should capitalize the value of their state pensions and really say, actually, you should be more in equities, because when you look at your whole picture of guaranteed benefits in state pensions, you're under or overweighted to where you ought to be. So if you're 70-30 not factoring in state pensions, and then you capitalize the value of the state pensions, actually you should be maybe 75-25, because in the grand scheme, you're 60-40 with the underpin of state pensions.
It's such a brilliant point. And actually, I started laughing as you were talking about this, because this is something that we are working on with Timeline risk scoring system. This idea of capitalizing or including, non-portfolio guaranteed incomes in the equation, and I remember having quite a animated conversation with my team. This actually started, by the way, because we were thinking of adding the annuities on, existing annuities that a client might have into the mix. Then people said, well, what about DB pensions? What about, state pensions? And I make exact same points. So it's fascinating that you agree with that point of view. I bet many financial planners disagree, which is also the other problem. We're trying to do these things with technology, because I put 10 planners in the room. You guys will give me 11 answers to everything.
Yes. But I've got to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of advisors haven't even considered it.
Yeah.
Genuinely. Yeah. It wouldn't, until you really stop to think about it. It's not something I thought about a long time ago. It was relatively more recently when I thought, well, you've got to capitalize the value on that, and so the client's overall portfolio requirements is going to be skewed, because they've already got a capitalized value of 500,000 to give them 22,000 a year in pensions.
Yeah, well, it's already skewed, absolutely, from the start, because they come in with a big, giant bond portfolio, otherwise known as state pension and DB pension, and then we do whatever it is we do. Then we include more bonds and more bonds in their liquid portfolios as well. There's liquidity in this equation, but to factor in this equation, but their portfolio is already skewed from the start. Maybe also screwed.
Freudian slip, Michael. That brings me back to one point on portfolio splits. Again, a misconception. So, and I've had this with clients in the past, and it comes around every now and again, where I'll have a conversation with a client, or even someone who's not a client, in a general conversation, and I'll say, "Oh, do you realise that the S&P 500 is up like 16% from January?" And they say, "Well, I'm invested. My investments are up 16%." I said, "No, but you're only a 60-40 portfolio split." But again, it's educating clients. Clients tend to think, if I've got an investment ISA or a pension, I am invested 100%. Yeah. Perception is reality. And then you say, well, no, actually, you will have only held on to the coattails of that 16%, with the 60% of your money that's invested in that area. And they go, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. You have to constantly re-educate people. It's like Nick Murray says, the body can't restore vitamin C. You've got to keep exposing them to it. And I'm a fervent believer in that, because it makes my life easier, and it explains ways people just don't think about these things, and they're not expected to. They've got lives to live. But that is a conversation I see time and again. Why didn't I get that return? Because you've only got 40-50% exposed to it. There's so many myths and misconceptions in our profession. It never ends. Another one I cover in my book is something called the performance illusion. You get a client and they get their statement. They get their annual statement, which is the biggest waste of paper in the world as far as I'm concerned. Right? But they get their annual statement, eyes bottom right. Is it up or is it down? If it's up, it normally goes in a box and they've had a happy day. If it's down, it normally ruins what could have been a good day for that client. But the performance illusion is this. People are numerically attuned and not percentage attuned. And I had a classic example with clients I took off a leading wealth management company in London. They were paying an extortionate amount of fees, and after fees and charges, they've been making like about 1.5%. Now, their 1.5% equated to about £10,000. So they looked at the £10,000 and thought, God, we've just made 10 grand this year. But when I expressed it as a percentage and how much the fund managers were taking, the penny dropped and they put their head in their hands. They were embarrassed. And these are bright people that run a successful business. They were embarrassed. They've been falling for the illusion, the performance illusion. Oh, £12,000, but it only equated to 1% of their portfolio. Now, it might be that was a good return in that year, but when I benchmarked it, as I already knew, it was bloody awful. And it had been for many, many years. So people fall for the performance illusion because they're numerically brained 9,000, 10, 12,000, and not, hang on a minute, wait, what does that return? Well, I could have got that just sat in a bank. So we're constantly having to unbundle misconceptions and illusions. And what I hope is coming through in this chat with you today is I am very passionate about doing this and always learning or trying to learn ways I can explain it in a way that a lay person can understand.
Fascinating stuff, Mike. I mean, this entire podcast is about, behavioral framework for navigating or dealing with client illusions or client misconceptions. So it's really powerful. And I have to be honest with you, you've restored my faith to an extent in behavioral finance, or because there was a time that behavioral finance was essentially just pointing out, our misconceptions, our behavioral flaws and error, especially when it comes to investing. But what you've done, and I get to the point, as many people, and I say, yes, so what? I know that I have short-term thinking. I know that I have different fallacies in the way that I deal with money. But so what? I think what you've done is, at least in this conversation, giving us 4 different framework to think about this, to educate clients about it, and I think that's really, really powerful. I like your analogies around the crystal ball. I like your assassin analogy around inflation. Just powerful tools. Before we start to wrap this up, so you've written your book, which I don't think it needs saying that it's essentially a book, with stories and framework for educating clients around these misconceptions. Is there any other powerful framework that you wanted to give us before we wrap up the podcast?
Not really. The book, Mind Over Markets, Uncovering Truths, Overcoming Biases, and How to Secure a Comfortable Retirement. It brings all this together, and it goes from our caveman views of flight and flight. It covers that, and it covers about the evolutionary pull of bad news and how it's part of our brains while we're attuned to bad news. Why we are, because we need to know when the headlines come on, it's nearly always a bad news. I mean, I don't call it the news, I call it the bad news because that's all it is. But our evolutionary brain, I tell clients you shouldn't be beating yourself up about this stuff because you can't help it. It's part of our makeup. The reason why headlines are nearly always bad news is deep in our psyche, we need to know, does that affect me? Is it on my doorstep? Is this something I need to be aware of? Then you're hooked. And much like the news that we get, it's all like bad news with no context. It's scandalous that the news channels, financial reporting, provide news with no context. The stock market fell 20 billion today, but it put on 100 billion in the last 7 years. No, that's not a good news story. If it bleeds, it reads. So I think that's a terrible, and it scares people. And you've got clients who are waiting for their retirement who were holed up on lockdown. The last thing they need from feeling insecure and lonely was thinking that all their money had gone. So I think it's horrendous that they take a terrible attitude without context. But I know that's what marketing does. I mean, I've just finished reading the book Alchemy, which is great, and there's a great analogy in there. Rory, I forgot his surname there. Rory is the author. But he came up with a great saying that Rory Sutherland it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. It's really good. Alchemy, really good. Behind how we make decisions. But something he did say made me laugh, and I used it in the frame of the context of financial news and all the crap that we have to deal with marketing companies with limitless budgets. And he, excuse my French, but he said, you must remember, when you multiply bullshit with bullshit, you don't just get a bit more bullshit, you get bullshit squared. Bullshit squared. And I thought, yeah, you're right there. And I think I heard it somewhere else. Someone said it to me years ago. Whether he said it first, I don't know, but it always stuck with me. So I'm always trying to temper people's clients, turn off the financial porn, control what you can control. And I tell clients right off the bat, there are only two things you can control, and you really need to learn and understand this. The only things you can control are your behavior around the news and the amount of fees you pay. Outside of that, everything else is navel-gazing and second-guessing. You must understand and fully appreciate those are the only two things you can control. If I could control more, or I knew what was going to be happening in the next 1, 5, and 10 years, I wouldn't be sat here talking to you. I'd be on a beach in the Bahamas many, many years ago. But the reality is I don't, and nor does the likes of Warren Buffett know. They only know what's going on around them right now. And recency bias, which I explain to clients, is the most dangerous and certainly the most prevalent bias that human investors have. Focusing short, medium, long-term plans on what just happens to be going on now and finding it hard to look down at the future for the long term.
Powerful, compelling stuff. Mike LeGassick, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Abraham, it's a pleasure talking to you. I know you're busy, and I'm really very grateful you gave me the time to get these points across. I really appreciate it. Thank you ever so much.
That's a wrap on today's show. Massive thanks to my production crew, especially Jake Osha, Melissa Canham, and the entire team. And of course, to our sponsor, Timeline, the market-leading provider of integrated planning technology and model portfolio service to advisors. I do hope you've enjoyed today's show. Head over to Apple Podcast and give us your review there. Until next time, goodbye.